Hello and welcome to this session on measuring the value of data in the economy and society. I'm Jeni Tennison, I'm Vice President and Chief Strategy Advisor at the Open Data Institute and also co-chair of the Data Governance Working Group at the Global Partnership on AI. This topic's really interesting because there have been so many studies about the economic value of data and how much we could unlock the value of data for the economy and for society if we do certain things with it. We do make concrete decisions based on the value we think that data has, you know, how much we invest in it, whether we make it open for others to use or keep it private for ourselves. But there are big challenges about how we think about how data generates value. So just because of the kind of economic characteristics of data, it's hard to put those kinds of figures on what it gives. So with me today, two real experts in this field to think about the value of data at both that kind of economy-wide and also at that organisational level. We've got Professor Diane Coyle, who is the Bennett Professor of Public Policy at the University of Cambridge, co-directs the Bennett Institute there and heads research on progress and productivity. Also has a new book out, Cogs and Monsters, which goes into how economics needs to change in response to the rewiring of society, including by digital technologies. And we also have Orlando Machado, who's Chief Data Officer at the Lego Group. He's interested in opportunities to use emerging technologies to evolve and transform established industries and has previously worked on data at Aviva, Money Supermarket and dunnhumby. So to get us into the topic, to start us off, I'd really like to ask each of you why the value of data is important to you and to the people that you work with, and how does the value of a data set change what you do or how you think about it? Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. You opened up talking about the overall economic value of data, and I think people often think about the macro aspects of this. You know, what's the data economy worth, or how should we think about incentivizing investment into certain technologies? I think what's interesting to me is that from a business perspective, the conversation is often very different. It's often very sort of micro-focused, thinking about specific instances in which data can add value and trying to measure those and measuring those in very, very different ways depending on the use case. So we often think from a commercial perspective about using data to achieve scale. You know, we can do 1 million things just as easily as we can do 1,000 things if we're making product recommendations to a customer. We often think about leverage. So we think about how can we build something once and then maybe repurpose it many times. And we also think about things like competitive advantage. So are there unique data assets or unique pieces of analysis that we can do to turn those data assets into insights that we can do that are very difficult to copy? And if we have a sufficiently broad mindset around data and we have a sufficiently fluent team understanding all the different ways in which data can drive opportunity, those things often manifest themselves in things like efficiency gains or direct revenue benefits, or maybe just being able to achieve a strategic objective like sustainability as an example. And so each one of those might be measured in a very, very different way, but we don't tend to worry too much about that. We tend to just make sure that the benefit and the value of what we return justifies the investment. And I think most companies right now are at a stage where there's so much to play for, so much to go after. People are at the start of this huge journey. So actually thinking about the macro level factors, it's like thinking about, you know, we're on the floor, we're trying to make the jump to the first step, and we're not too worried about where the ceiling is because we're so far from that. There's so much to go for. So it's not such a problem for us to think about very micro level measures of value, each of which is extremely important and each of which needs to justify the investment, but we don't need to go too much further than that.
And when you were talking about that there, you seem to be talking about the value coming from particular uses and the way that what that enabled you to do, rather than thinking about it in terms of a particular data set having a particular value. Have I got that right?
I think that's right. It's probably slightly deeper than that, in that we end up talking about the value of having a data literate or data fluent mindset. rather than the value of the actual data asset that we've got. And so we start to see that if you have a bias to using data, we think about experimentation and testing and learning and the ability to scale up things that work and cut things that don't work. And each one of those things can deliver measurable value as an initiative. And that ends up being a more important conversation than this particular data asset that we have and how do we quantify the value of that specific thing.
Really interesting. Thanks, Orlando. So Diane, let's go to that macroeconomic view. Talk to us about your interest in value of data and how you think about it.
Well, it starts with the micro, actually. Economists are interested in business. Businesses make up a lot of the macroeconomy. And so it's really interesting to hear Orlando talk about it's the use you can make of data that really adds value for the company. And there's a growing amount of economic research that's backing that up, looking across a very wide range of companies, because it's only a minority that know how to use their data assets well to deliver better services, serve their customers better, make their processes more efficient. And so in many countries, we're seeing the top 5% or so of firms really pulling away from the others in terms of productivity and profit because they're the ones that are using data. So from the economy-wide perspective, you want to understand what's the secret sauce that enables them to do that. How can you spread that to other companies? And of course, that dilutes the competitive advantage that you're building up as an individual organisation. But for the economy as a whole, for wages to grow and skills to improve, we need to see that spread. But I'm also interested in thinking about the kinds of value from data that don't just come from individual organisations using it. And that comes from one of the economic characteristics of data, is what we would call in our jargon a non-rival good, and that means that it doesn't get used up. So different people could use the same data set to do useful things, it wouldn't deplete it at all, and you can add much more value if you can make it accessible. And there are two kinds of reasons for thinking about that. One is competition. There are some very big companies that are sitting on large amounts of very large data sets, and they dominate their markets. So competition authorities around the world are thinking about how to make, in some way, some of that data open access to open up the markets. But there's also just the possibilities that emerge from different people with different ideas and different backgrounds being able to access some data and doing something completely different with it. Because if you go back down to the micro, the kinds of value that we get from data will be, it makes our life easier, it brings us new products, it saves us time, all of those things. And we need other organisations, other businesses to be able to come along and innovate and do that. And so I'm rather reluctant, although national statistical offices want to have a number to put in the national accounts and governments want to grow their data economy, I'm a bit suspicious of going, oh, it's whatever £1 billion it is, because it's thinking about how do you make it useful in all these different ways across the economy that will bring us all the benefits of data.
That's really interesting and really good. I mean, you take that, obviously coming from the Bennett Institute, you take that public policy kind of perspective on this. The other area I think of with where there's public policy around data is the management of their own public data assets. So things like the census or geospatial data or weather data, which are managed in kind of public hands. Do you have views on the value of the public sector doing that work for the rest of the economy?
I would like to see government and the public sector broadly think much more about the data infrastructure that they are making available to businesses and individuals across the economy, and thinking about how much more they should be investing in that, what they should be allowing other people to join up across different public data sets, and just the level of how should the public sector be collecting data that's going to be useful for people. We've got a fantastic ONS, National Statistical Office here, but traditionally they have collected a certain category of economic statistics. There's demand now, for example, to have those at a much more granular geographic level, partly because of levelling up type agendas, but also partly because people are starting to have ideas about what they would like to do, if only they knew for their own town certain facts that aren't available. And so we need just much more thought about what the national investment in that infrastructure ought to be, how it's going to be safeguarded, and made high quality, and who is going to get access under what conditions.
Brilliant.
I think there's a parallel there with the way that companies are now thinking about data, because I think there was a lot of talk about data and data science, and I think people are now thinking a lot more about the platforms, the infrastructure, the governance, access management, permissions, all of these kind of things, the enabling factors that allow people to use data in the correct and responsible way. And that's a conversation that I think most companies are having now at a much deeper level than I think people were having even just a handful of years ago.
And do you think they're also thinking about where the public sector should be supporting them in that kind of access, or forming consortia with other companies about it, or is it still very kind of internal? Whatever.
Well, I think it's back to the, I think companies are relatively immature, and even the companies that are making very good use of data are still thinking that there's a lot more to go. We're still sort of scratching the surface. So I think it's quite often further down the line that companies try to think about forming groups, consortia, think about the public sector. And I think at the beginning, companies are probably quite rightly trying to get their own house in order first before we can all think about how to collaborate in a way that's more effective.
There are some policy issues here as well, because if you're thinking about sharing data between companies across the supply chain, your first port of call actually has to be the competition authorities to make sure that at least they understand what you're doing and they know that it's not creating barriers to other entrants to the market.
Yeah, and I found it interesting in times where, like the recent petrol crisis, where there are restrictions on supply for particular goods. One of the things that is loosened around that is the exchange of information about supply that otherwise isn't allowed to be passed around, right?
So there's a question about where's the boundary between what's properly commercially confidential and shouldn't be shared, and what becomes part of the data environment that we all ought to be able to access.
Yeah, really interesting. So one thing that I find when talking about data is that because it is very abstract, hard to get our hands on, then we tend to go to metaphors to explain it and talk about it. And Orlando, you worked with Clive Humby at dunnhumby, and who said, data is oil, which is one of those phrases that many of us now go, no, it really isn't oil. But tell us about that metaphor and whether you agree with it or not.
Well, I think I've got a soft spot for the metaphor, data is the new oil. I worked with Clive. He said it around about 2006, 2007, so relatively early on. And I think now it's become maybe a little bit trendy to bash that metaphor. I think, talking about the reusability, talking about the fact that oil's a finite resource, and maybe data can be potentially infinite. And I think there are lots of ways in which the metaphor is maybe, has its limits, but metaphors are always simplifications. You're always trying to distill it down to something, a kind of a key message. And to me, it still works quite well, because I think on the one hand, you've got oil as an asset, and I think data as a new oil was a sort of rallying cry to businesses to say, there's an asset here that you're sitting on, you're not really paying attention to it, you're not really treating it seriously. But also, if you heard Clive talking about it, he would talk about how, in its raw form, it's messy and hard to use. In the wrong hands, it's explosive. Quite often, it's third parties who can make better use of it. And there are lots of aspects to the metaphor that are a bit more nuanced than I think it's given credit for. So I quite like it, because I think it gets the balance right between thinking about the benefits of oil and the assets of it, and also some of the liabilities or some of the risks associated with using data, particularly using data badly. And so, I still like it. I still think it holds up today, and I still think it has some value.
Cool. And Diane, you've got an alternative metaphor you prefer?
Yes, well, you slightly reconciled me to it. But because of that non-rivalry aspect, economists don't really like the oil metaphor at all. And also because it's, oil is a commodity. So a gallon of oil, roughly speaking, or a barrel roughly has the same price or the same value. My alternative is a data atmosphere. So air is non-rival in the same way, and also it can be clean and lovely, and it can be polluted, and you can get different atmospheric conditions. So I'm going to try pitching data as air.
Yeah, there are definitely some of those kind of public good aspects about clean air that also fall on data. For me personally, I like metaphors that are about that highlight it's not a natural resource. It's one that we build, that we construct, that we choose how to, we choose what data to collect and what data we don't. So I prefer things like, you mentioned data as infrastructure. I tend to talk about it as roads, because those are things that we build and we choose where they go. These are not just natural resources that fall from the sky. And that implies investment. It implies needing to build what we need in order to flourish. The other thing that I find with conversations about about data in general is that, but particularly value of data, is that we talk at this kind of high level and don't go very concrete about, what are we actually talking about when we value some data, or value a data set, or value what we can get out of it, or the value that comes to a company or to society. So my go-to kind of figures around this are things like the Deloitte study about the value of TfL's open data, which for me was really interesting in that it unpicked the value to TfL itself of not having to do a bunch of work because it made that data available. The value in terms of the number of organisations and startups that were created and jobs that were created on top of it, and the value to everyday commuters, when there were commuters, in being able to choose better routes around the city and kind of time saved. And that was about, I think the value is between 90 and 140 million per annum off the back of investing 1 million in open data. But then there is some huge numbers like 11 billion pounds per year unlocked through open geospatial data, which I just wonder where they come from. So Diane, do these figures ring true to you? Do you think that they're generated? You were saying that this isn't the way that we should be thinking about it, having these kind of economic figures, but they seem to be useful for arguments. So how should we reconcile that?
You're right to say that they do have an impact on people. So if you say a number like 11 billion pounds to the Treasury, it's going to arouse their interest. So I can see the tactical interest in them. But for most people, they go 1, 2, 3, oh, it's a really big number. So 11 billion, 27 trillion, what's the difference? I know they're different. I think of the value much more in terms of what use do people get out of it. And for companies, you can often turn that into a monetary figure. It could be cost savings, it could be addition to profits because of a new product, whatever it is, you can turn that into useful numbers. And clearly boards need to know those numbers because they're choosing among alternative investments and uses of resources. So that's absolutely essential. But for many people, it will also be value in terms of how does this data turn into information that I can use to help me with things that matter to me. So for each of us in our personal life, it might be much more, this is going to save me 20 minutes a day. And that's really useful and valuable. And you don't need to put a monetary value on that. So I do understand the tactical appeal of the big numbers, but I think to really understand the value and the policy choices and the business choices that need to be made, we need to start unpicking those numbers.
And Orlando, in a kind of business context, do you find that you need to take those kind of numbers to the boards in order to persuade them to make investment, either in data or, as you were saying, about capability in people?
I think it's important to take enough numbers to the board to make the case for the investment. And I think quite often we see that the return on investment could be so high that we don't always have to measure everything. We have to measure enough things to make the case. But I think there are also broader market trends around companies with higher levels of data and analytical maturity, broadly being top quartile performers in their industry sectors. There are figures around higher stock market valuations for companies that are using data first. But I think when it comes to taking figures to a board, quite often it can be around experiments. It could be about just trying to have split test experiments and trying to understand revenue benefits from a particular approach that's more data driven. Or it could be about trying to think about efficiency gains, trying to think about how we make better use of especially our skilled workforce. So if we think about how we make lives easier or how we remove bottlenecks in processes, those kind of business cases can work very well, because I think as long as the board can understand and relate to the use case, then I think you're in a better position to make the case. And it doesn't always have to be a financial measure. Quite often the value measure can be non-financial.
Right. So let's dig into that a bit more about these, about how you measure value, how you talk about it. So I know, Diane, you've been looking at different mechanisms for measuring value at that kind of larger scale. Talk us through the different ways that you can measure the value of data.
There are a number of ways that people are trying. There's no settled way to do it, and national statistical offices are looking at cost-based measures, so they look at how much companies are spending through their workforce on creating and maintaining databases. So looking at costs is one approach. Stock market values, Orlando mentioned, so there are some papers looking at how much difference does it make in terms of market valuation if you're a data-using company versus not a data-using company, and you can aggregate that up to an industry sector. So I've done that with Wendy Lee in the US for the hospitality sector. You can ask people survey-based approaches, which are widely used in environmental or cultural economics to try to value things that don't have a market price. So if I'm interested in thinking about the sort of public good aspects of data, that's an interesting approach, and so we've tried that one. And you could alternatively, for an organisation, think about a real options approach. There's a formula for putting a monetary value on something that gives you a strategic option into the future. And another way is to think about what difference would it make to important KPIs for the company and profits if they were to use this data, and that's done essentially through simulation methods. So there's this whole array, and I suppose the holy grail is that we find a method that builds enough consensus that people go, yeah, this is how we will value this kind of data set. I'm not sure at the moment whether we will get there. We're at the stage of trying these different experiments and seeing what kind of numbers emerge from them.
And do you think that different kinds of approaches might work for different types of data or in different kinds of situations?
I think so, because the value is the use value, and for any economic good, use values differ very widely. But for data and digital goods, they're extremely, extremely variable. And so I think you might, as you suggest, want to look at different types of uses in different ways.
But I think we're talking about quite a difficult problem to solve. And I think, even within a relatively narrow field, if you think about marketing measurement, where there's been a lot of work in data over the years, it's a relatively mature field. But if you think about the ways in which people measure micro-level, very targeted marketing, which is typically high-level versions of experimental designed experiments where you can measure very precisely what's happening, versus broadcast marketing, which is still a very big part of the marketing mix, where people are using high-level econometric models, trying to unpick all the different factors that might influence somebody to buy something, and trying to attribute a part of that to the marketing spend. Those two methods are very difficult, very, very different. Quite often they have to be assessed differently, and quite often budget decisions have to be made in a different way. And that's not too big a deal within a company, but it becomes quite a big deal if you're trying to get consensus across a huge variety of use cases, when even within one relatively narrow case, there are still lots of different methods being used to solve essentially the same kind of problem. So I find it hard to see how we're going to get consensus on this, because for a start it's quite difficult, and we've got lots of different methods even within a very specific problem. And secondly, it's not always clear where the incentives are to build consensus around these kind of methods. I don't know what's driving it.
Well, maybe one incentive might come if we're aiming for an economy where we're passing around data a lot, right? Where we're sharing it, where we're selling it, then having some kind of consensus about what the value is of that data becomes an important part of making an informed market that works around it.
And there are people thinking about creating these markets, partly for competition access reasons, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of thought about those kind of markets at different levels, including consumers taking control of their own data, having personal data stores, effectively trading personal data with companies for various gains. And I think it's quite difficult, as soon as you get to a landscape where you've got many different companies who are going to be using data for many different purposes, for a consumer to really understand and make informed choices about how to trade that data. If we think about, you mentioned that I'd worked at dunnhumby. dunnhumby's best known for the Tesco Club Card scheme. And in the early days of Tesco Club Card, there was quite a clear transaction. Customers were aware that they were sharing data with Tesco, and Tesco were giving very relevant offers back to that customer in a fairly kind of contained way. People knew that they were getting offers for the things that they liked. And that was relatively straightforward. If you get to a stage where people are sharing data with a whole load of online advertisers, and it can be quite difficult to understand how that data is being turned into insight or how generalizations are being made, then I think it becomes increasingly difficult for consumers to make informed choices. So again, the fact that people are thinking about this at a market level doesn't, to me, mean that there's an easy answer. I mean, I'm interested, and we're tracking these developments, but I'm interested to know how consumers will become sufficiently aware to be able to make proper informed choices here.
Have you been looking at this at either that kind of monetization of personal data level, or at the kind of more business to business kind of transactions and the markets around those, Diane?
The ones that I'm aware of have been looking at the business to business transactions. I don't myself think it's fair to expect individuals to understand either the privacy rights and consent that's needed, or to be able to identify particular value. And I think most people at some level appreciate that they are giving away data and getting free services that they really value. So you shouldn't expect to have to test your food yourself when you go and buy it in the supermarket. You expect there to be a regulatory environment that makes it safe for you. And so I'm much more interested in thinking about institutional and governance frameworks that make it perfectly safe for people, and they get a good deal in the sense that they get some of the benefits of how that data is being used.
Yeah. That reminds me back to the kind of data as oil analogy. So, one of the things about that is the externality of carbon dioxide emissions and the kind of impacts that has on our wider environment. And there is a nice analogy there with data and the impacts that the use of it have on us as individuals, on our communities, and those kinds of wider costs. When you're looking at the value of data, are you thinking about how are you wrapping in those costs to, it might be around competition, it might be around privacy, it might be around environmental costs, indeed, with data processing. How do you think about that at an organisational level?
I wouldn't say we have a very formal way of trying to cost these things, but we do think very differently about data depending on different types of sensitivity associated with the data. And we think a lot about our reputation, we think about consumer trust. We take very conservative approaches when we're thinking about our main consumers at the Lego Group, who are children. So we typically don't collect data at scale for children. We have a lot of other types of research, which is very much around consent, and it's very little about collecting lots of data, actually, when it comes to children, because we're very aware of the sensitivities. At the other end of the scale, though, we have data from moulding machines, which is generated at massive scale, where we don't have anywhere near the same kind of sensitivities around the personal aspects of data, but we do potentially have a lot of intellectual property associated with our practices that we know that people would want to copy. So we think about it very differently depending on the type of data that we're collecting, and we take an approach which is, I wouldn't say it's particularly formal, but I think it's quite, we try to be very well informed in terms of the kind of risks associated with using this data badly or irresponsible use of the data, offset against the benefits of trying to drive value from that data.
There seems to be a really difficult trade-off going on between wanting to protect the privacy of individuals and wanting to get the benefits of being able to join up different kinds of data and do new things with it, including across organisations. And I've been really taken with this concept I've come across in the sociology literature. I'm an economist, so we're really badly educated, and I've only just come across it. But it's the concept of privacy in public. And the idea is that in normal life, people will know things about you, but only certain things about you. They don't join up the data about the whole person. So I don't want you to know about my embarrassing medical problem, but I do want my doctor to know about it, is the rough idea. And somehow we've not managed to translate that online, because there are organisations that join up all of the data about us. And that's what we don't want to happen. So it's thinking about what joining up is good and what are the institutions that enable that, and then which ones do you want to rule out because the privacy is so important.
And I think all companies have their own versions of that kind of problem. I worked at Aviva for a few years, and quite often insurance companies are known for collecting data on things like driving risk. I think some of those things are, on the face of it, they could be seen as not too sensitive, but all of a sudden, if you're trying to combine data from various sources and you have data on the car somebody drives, the valuable possessions that come from home insurance, their holiday habits that come from travel insurance, that you suddenly understand, the security level in the house. You start to put that together and you've got extremely sensitive data. And so I think all companies could do well to understand the sort of the multiplicative effect of putting data together when it comes to a sensitivity perspective, because I think it's not always obvious. And I think there's a problem when data is often collected in silos, that the individual people who are responsible for those data sets aren't always aware of what can happen when it all comes together. And I think that should be something that companies are increasingly aware of.
Changing topic a little bit, a lot of the narrative that's around about data and in the national data strategy is around unlocking the value of data. We talk about that a lot, and I always wonder how you can work out what the kind of prospective value of data might be if you did different kinds of things. And how people put figures like that 11 billion that I said earlier about, prospectively, if we did this, this is what it would be worth. Have you got any thoughts about how you do that? If we did this, then this value would be unlocked. How do we put numbers or get a grip on that kind of question?
This is why we're having a go at trying to think about real options and can you put a numerical method on this? And of course, you're going to get a range of numbers out of it, but perhaps that will narrow it down a bit and you can start to think about the scale of opportunities. It's not absolutely straightforward, and this is very much work in progress. So I don't know if it's going to work out. But I think the other important thing about it is that you need to have a strategic context. And so for a business, that might be, we're going to take our business in this direction. We've got these risks from competitors on the horizon. What are the strategic options we need to be able to do that? So it's going to be directed. You have to think about the value in context, as well as thinking about what the options might be.
I think from a business perspective, it often comes down to scenario planning. So coming up with scenarios with a range of options again, and trying to say, as an example, if 10% more customers were to put one additional product in their basket when they're shopping online and it was worth between this amount and this amount, this is the kind of notional value that it could unlock. That's at the beginning, and people can kind of debate whether those are kind of realistic assumptions. But I think it very closely gets to testing. So as soon as you start to put one of those data-driven initiatives in place, you can stress test the assumptions very, very quickly. And I think the discipline around testing and learning is a key part of the data method that I think is really, really important, because it often means you don't have to understand too much up front, because you can learn very, very quickly.
So one other aspect of this that I find interesting is how new data sets might come on the market or be made available, and because data is multiplicative, right? When you add two data sets together, you get new value out of it. Those new data sets actually add value to something that you already have. But we don't know when that's going to happen sometimes, right? It might be that a competitor suddenly comes on the market and opens up some data that you thought was a competitive advantage, and you no longer have it. How do you think about that kind of, like you've talked about scenario planning, but not everything is predictable. I think that we can know that there are going to be new technologies, new data sets out there, but it doesn't, how do you narrow down the scenarios?
I think one of my favourite quotes was from the Danish physicist Niels Bohr, who said, "Prediction's very difficult, especially about the future." And it's absolutely true. I think it is very difficult to predict things. Data can help you. We can have all sorts of methods to try to forecast things. But I think where data often helps more than that is just the process of learning very quickly. So the idea that you don't have to have predictions that go very far into the future. You don't have to have predictions that are very accurate. We have to have rough ideas that this is worth the small investment involved in doing the first experiment. and then we can try to learn very quickly and kill the things that don't work, scale up the things that do work. So I think that there's a part to there's a kind of aspect to being data fluent or being data driven, which is much more about experimentation than it is about true prediction.
It's just an inherent feature of the economy we're in. It's a nightmare for economists because we want to have a depreciation rate to attach to an asset, and it could be high or it could be zero. You don't know. But this is true of all intangible assets, and the stock market value of most companies now is their intangible assets. And you just have to think about companies whose reputation got destroyed, and the value of those assets goes to zero overnight. I think that's just the world we're in.
Right, and so. Estimating risk around it or that kind of thing might be a way of adding some subtlety into the way that you're thinking about the value of data and how it might change.
Yes, but good luck estimating the variance in the distribution.
Okay. So I think we've got about 10 minutes left. So let's move on to kind of trying to wrap this up. So for people who are in the audience who are either kind of in a business context or they're maybe in a policy making context, or people who are looking at research in this or whatever, what do you think are the next steps around these questions of the value of data and how we unlock it and how we put measures against it? What are the things that we need to investigate more, to research more, to get to grips with? Maybe Diane, at the kind of measurement for whole economy level, what are the techniques that we need to be trying out?
There are lots of things that we need to know. So certainly trying these techniques and seeing which of them seem to be effective. Actually just gathering data on data and understanding the flows and who holds what. And then the other big question for me is about the institutional and governance framework, where I think we're just in the foothills of figuring out where we want to get to with all of that and how do we balance these different trade-offs there are between privacy and access and how to keep it secure and all of those things that you're so familiar with.
Can you talk more about the collecting data about data? So is this like adding things to national statistics that we have around the data market? What would you like to see there?
Yeah, there's a great desire among the national statistics community to have some estimates of these. So certain data sets do go into the national accounts at the moment, but a very small proportion of them. And so at the moment, there is a debate underway about what methods to use to collect those numbers in an aggregate way. The other debate is about what to invest in national statistics themselves. And then the data on just flows to data centres and between different companies, it's very obscure, we don't really know. And cross-border flows is another increasingly important issue, where a lot of the debate is about data localization, got to keep our data where we are. That's not a good approach for many small, hot countries that are never going to have their own data centres. They're going to have cross-border data flows to be able to use the data. So having a more nuanced debate about that also is going to be important.
Yeah, I know the National Data Strategy Implementation team are looking at like how they measure success against the National Data Strategy, right? What are the KPIs they can use? And it seems to me that some of those things that you just talked about are measures that we could be using in 3-5 years' time in order to say, yes, our policies have actually had an effect on the way that the economy is working. And what about at a business context? Where is there a need for? I mean, you've talked about many businesses kind of being behind in this space. Is there a need for more kind of standardised procedures, processes, better knowledge or understanding about how to get the best out of that?
I think knowledge and understanding for sure. I think building a high degree of data literacy and a broad knowledge of the different ways in which data can add value, I think that's a good starting point for people. I think as soon as you have that broad knowledge, you start to build up a workforce that understands many, many opportunities for driving value from data, which is where I think often a sort of a clear ethical framework and a governance framework comes in, because understanding the parameters and the constraints in which each company wants to operate becomes very, very important. Once you've got the broad knowledge, once you've got the clear sort of guardrails, I think then enabling people to use as many ways to attack the problem as possible, I think is really important. So there are many different types of measurement frameworks, some financial, some non-financial, It could be about revenue, it could be about efficiency gains, it could be about productivity, it could be about profit, it could be about delivering against other strategic objectives. But allowing people to use as many tools from the toolkit as possible, I think works very well from a company perspective once the baseline of data literacy and once the baseline of governance and ethics is there.
And the other point that I think that you made throughout our conversation has been about experimentalism and the ability to experiment, which itself seems like a skill, something that organisations need to learn.
I think it's a mindset shift. You know, I think people have been very used to trying to plan for a very long time in advance. And I think for some things that still happens. But for many things, we can run very short experiments at low cost that allow us to learn very quickly. And just opening that as an opportunity is a news thing for many companies. And I think that's quite often the mindset shift that has to be made.
Excellent. So we're almost out of time, but I'd like to come to each of you to ask you for a final kind of tweetable comment that you'd like to give to the audience, the main message that you'd like them to take away. Diane, can we come to you first?
Data is valuable if it allows you to turn it into information that lets you do things better that you want to do.
Brilliant. And Orlando?
I would say think about a clear data ethics framework. Think about building data fluency across the organisation and then measure what you can along the way. And I think the value will come.
Excellent. I've really enjoyed having this conversation with both of you. Thank you both so much. And yeah, look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you very much.